Alright, good evening everyone, good evening Marcus. Um,
Hi, John.
this is the first in the sequence of Project Baseline lockdown talks. I'm just clicking some buttons here and seeing whether we've got actually anyone watching us yet. Hopefully we will do. Right, I've got one engagement apparently. Two people watching, and probably one of those is me. But there we go. Never mind. People will join us in a minute, I'm sure. Um, I'll uh, I'll give the regulars a kick as well. Um, so this evening we have Marcus. This is Marcus's idea, so I'm just here to fill some space for him. But we have Marcus, who's going to tell us a little bit about what is Project Baseline, why is it important, what's the importance of uh, conservation in the aquatic world and with diving. Um, and there we go. We've got a couple of people online, including Ryan, who's just being rude, so that's always good. And hello, Jamie. Um,
No, nothing changes.
Nothing changes. All right, good stuff. Right, well, without further ado, I am going to click some buttons here, and Marcus can start talking to us. So here we go.
Thanks, John, for the introduction. That's great. Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all well. For those in England, I hope first couple of days of lockdown haven't been too painful. Hopefully, this is going to make it less painful and not worse. But we'll see how the next 20 minutes or so goes. So what I wanted to do really was just have a fairly informal approach to this. So I'm just going to talk through something that's a real passion of mine, really, which is marine conservation and marine project diving. Having young kids when you're trying to do something presentational is great. Elizabeth, night night. See you later on.
Night, night.
Night night. See you later. Good timing. So, like I say, yeah, fairly informal little presentation. I'm going to talk to you about some of the issues that are facing the marine environment at the moment. And then there'll be plenty of chance to ask questions as we go through. So please either put your questions into the comment section. John will come in and correct me if I'm wrong. And I'll pause after each of the sort of big sections to bring John in and see if there's any questions as we go through. I am a passionate amateur. I'm not a sort of professional marine biologist or anything. I am doing a master's in marine science, but it's very, very early days. So I welcome any challenge or any useful input from those in the audience that might have a better idea of or more information to bring in on some of these topics than I do. All right. So, as John mentioned, this is the first in a series of 4 presentations. So I'm going to sort of outline really what Project Baseline is about and why I think it's a good thing to be involved with as both a passionate diver and somebody interested in marine science. And hopefully that will set up the presentations that are to come over the next 3 or 4 weeks. So we've got a presentation next week from Martin Maple and probably Rob Corby, maybe as a duo, talking about the Midland Pools Project Baseline site, one of the local projects that we've got going. The following week is Vanessa and Martin are going to talk to us about some fantastic work that's being done up on the west coast of Scotland. A really exciting project, that one actually. There's 2 people really involved in the project with some support from Sea Search. And they've done some fantastic work, some fantastic results, and are making some real progress in the monitoring of the fireworks anemones up there. So that'd be really exciting. And then to conclude, on the Monday the 30th, rather than a Friday, we've got Dr. Todd Kincaid, who is the originator of Project Baseline and still heads up the organisation. So that'll be an exciting presentation on a cornerstone project that they did out in Bermuda. So I hope they offer some entertainment for you over the coming weeks whilst we're in this sort of lockdown period. Okay, so what are we going to cover this evening? Well, I guess I should start by just introducing myself for 30 seconds. So if you're tuned in and watching and haven't met me before, Marcus Rose, I'm a passionate diver, diving instructor, but my real passion with diving is using the diving for project diving. up until recently up on the west coast of Scotland, which is a fantastic place to live, dive, and do any sort of submarine conservation effort. But now sort of based back down on the south coast, so diving around the UK and more broadly elsewhere around the world as well, getting involved in projects. And most recently, I've taken on managing Project Baseline UK, so helping to support the local projects, and we'll talk a little bit more about that structure and what we're trying to achieve later on in this presentation. So as I mentioned right at the start, I'm going to touch really on three key challenges facing the marine environment at the moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about global warming and the impact that that's having. Talk a little bit about plastics more broadly, but also in the marine environment, and again the challenges that brings. And then a little bit, just going to touch very briefly on fishing practices. Just going to touch on that very briefly before moving on to talking about Project Baseline in a bit more depth and what it's trying to achieve. Hopefully sort of 15-20 minutes of me talking, and then take any questions afterwards. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about really is global warming and how that affects the oceans and what it means for some of the challenges that face us in terms of identifying the effect that it has and really affecting any sort of change to correct it. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about why the oceans are so important in sort of regulating the temperature on Earth, and why if we let it run out of control and don't do something about it, it's going to cause us a big problem, and how we as divers ultimately can help that problem by identifying and educating those that aren't privileged enough, like we are, to be underwater regularly and to see it. So the diagram you see on the screen there is the first step in the story, really, about why the oceans are so important to us. So if we didn't have an atmosphere around Earth, and if we didn't have oceans and movement of atmospheric gases and also the liquids that sit on Earth's surface, so the oceans, what would happen is Earth would essentially be a black body just floating in space. And this is going to be one of the most unscientific explanations of some of these processes as we go through, but really in the interest of time. But if there's any questions, and please bring those out as we go through. But essentially, if we had none of those things in place, so atmosphere and movement of gases and water across the Earth's surface, the temperature on Earth would be about minus 18 degrees. And that's just some very, very, very clever maths, taking into account the energy that's produced by the sun, the distance that energy is travelling, and taking into account the fact that it is reflected back into space. So clearly, at minus 18 degrees, Earth would be uninhabitable to the majority, if not all, of living things that are on the Earth at the moment, and in the absence of an atmosphere, even more so. So, how is it that the atmosphere is tenable for us to live in, and why is it not minus 18 degrees all of the time? Well, really it's because of the atmosphere within which we live. So the previous slide just showed the fact that all of that energy from the sun was coming in, hitting the Earth's surface, and it was being re-radiated back into space, so none of it was being retained, and that accounted for that low temperature. What happens in reality is we have this atmosphere around the Earth's surface, and that in combination with things like polar ice, things like the oceans, it does things to that energy that's transmitted from the sun. And this slide points out some of those things that are occurring. So the thing that has the biggest impact is the atmosphere itself. So the effect that the atmosphere has is that it absorbs a lot of that energy that's re-radiated back from the Earth from that previous diagram. It absorbs that energy and then re-radiates it back to the Earth. So it's almost like a three-step process: energy in from the sun, re-radiated back from the Earth into the atmosphere, and then it bounces back towards the Earth's surface. It essentially traps a lot of that energy in, okay, and it allows the Earth's surface to be much warmer than the minus 18 degrees that we predicted in that previous model. It's actually much more complicated than that, and there's a lot going on in terms of how much polar ice there is will determine how much of that energy is just reflected directly back to Earth. As we'll talk about a little bit later on, the composition of the atmosphere also has a big impact on how much of that energy is absorbed. But this still isn't the full story. So even having made that step from this black body just floating around in space and adding that atmosphere around the Earth's surface, it still doesn't account for how the Earth is habitable all the way from the poles down to the equator. Because essentially, if this were all that was happening and we had an atmosphere in place, the area around the equator on the Earth would be excessively hot and the poles would be excessively cold. And whilst we might see them as really hot and really cold, we would be talking about a much, much bigger change in temperature as you moved north or south from the equator, to the effect that it would be uninhabitable once you got anywhere near where we live in the UK, if there wasn't some sort of way of distributing this heat around the Earth's surface. Okay. Well, let's see if the slides to shift on. Great. Okay, so like I said, if there was no movement across the Earth's surface, this area that you can see in the middle of the slide here around the equator, up to about the tropics, would be really, really hot. And anything outside of that would pretty much be uninhabitable. What happens in reality is we have air masses that move that heat away from the equator. So just the movement of the Earth itself through the Coriolis effect will generate movement in the atmosphere, and the fact that you've got this heat at the equator and a much cooler environment at the poles also generates movement of the wind and the atmosphere in which we live. And as that wind and that atmosphere is moving over the water surface, the friction of as it moves across is also moving the water, and it generates surface currents across the ocean. And they move in these big circles that you can see on the slide here. And what that does essentially is it's distributing the heat around the Earth's surface, and it's making the rest of Earth habitable for us away from the equator. Again, that's still not the full story, and the last bit of the picture that I'm going to talk to you about before I talk about why this is important is we're going to talk about, just briefly touch on deep ocean currents. So even though we've got surface currents that are generated by that atmosphere and that wind movement, what that doesn't do is impact the deep water. And it's the deep water that makes up, and we're talking about below about sort of 1,000 meters, makes up 90% of the body of water on Earth. And once you get down to those sorts of depths, the water is extremely cold, even at the equator. And it's not, the movement of that water is not affected by these ocean currents. It's actually affected by the density of the water. So this diagram you can see on the slide here shows the equator in the middle at 0 degrees, and then it shows all the way up to 70 north and 70 south. And what this is showing is that as water moves away from the equator towards the poles, it gets more and more dense. And that's generated by a cooling in temperature, but it's also generated by ice formation as you get towards the poles, which makes the water much more, adds salinity to the water, and again makes it denser, and therefore it drops down below the water in which it's sat around. And that's how these massive volumes of water are moved around the globe, and it's really important and essential, really, for life on Earth, because what it's doing is it's not only making the temperature and the atmosphere sustainable to life, but it's also moving nutrients around the Earth as well. Okay, so having talked a little bit about what should happen and what does happen, now we're going to introduce the problem that is caused by global warming, and then we can talk about the sort of so what of that. So we talked at the start about the atmosphere being really important for maintaining heat within the Earth's atmosphere. But essentially, any gas molecule that has three particles within it, so carbon dioxide, for example, will absorb this energy that's reflected away from Earth and re-radiate it back down towards Earth. So the more of those types of gases there are in the atmosphere, the more energy is going to be absorbed and re-radiated back down to Earth. So as carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere through things like burning fossil fuels, things like driving our cars, but also just things like cutting down trees and getting rid of the carbon and burning the wood, it all releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, traps more energy and makes the Earth's surface warmer and warmer. So what does that mean for us? Well, it results in sea temperatures rising, which in itself you might not think is a huge problem, but it has a really significant impact on life within the oceans. It does things like bleaches corals and affects coral reefs, which account for a huge volume of biodiversity within the oceans. It also causes the ice caps to melt, and so you get much less ice formation at the extremes of the two poles, and therefore that density of water that we relied on to drop the water back into the deep ocean and circulate the temperature around the Earth's surface is significantly reduced. And the other thing it does is it increases stratification of the oceans. So you get much warmer layers sitting on the top of that cold, dense water. And the problem that causes is it means that all of those nutrients from the deep can't break up through that layer and provide nutrients for things like phytoplankton in the shallows, which account for, depending on where you look and which statistics you look at, somewhere between 50 and 85% of all of the oxygen production on the Earth's surface. All right, I'm just going to pause there for 2 seconds. John, are there any questions coming up in the chat, or shall I just carry on?
No questions so far, but if anyone has any questions, now is the time to throw them up. We might have to wait 20 seconds whilst the delay goes through and people see it.
That's fine. Ryan isn't still just giving us abuse then?
Yeah, pretty much. Alright, I'm not seeing any questions coming in at the moment, so I think I'd carry on if I were you, Marcus.
Alright, great. Okay, so the second issue that I'm going to talk about is one that I would imagine if you are an avid diver or have any sort of interest in the oceans, it's something that you'll recognise as an issue. And that's the issue of plastics generally, but also plastics in the ocean, so marine plastics. A huge issue, something that's come about because of the mass production of this fantastic substance, really, that from somewhere around the mid 20th century kind of transformed a lot of products that we buy. It had such utility that we ended up producing, and some of these figures were a bit of a surprise to me when I was preparing the presentation. But 8.3 billion tons of plastic since we started mass production in the middle of the 20th century. We produce 1.7 million tons of plastic in the UK annually. And all of that because of the fact that it doesn't decompose, or it decomposes over hundreds and hundreds of years, means it's got to end up somewhere, either in landfill or very commonly in the oceans of the world. Even to the extent that it's now found in some of the most remote places on the planet. So in the deepest parts of the oceans, these plastics have been found. And like I say, they take so long to decompose that they pose a real issue. One of the answers is possibly recycling, but the recycling of plastics is also a huge challenge. You have to have particularly clean plastics fed into the recycling system. If it's contaminated in any way, then it can't be recycled. And as the plastic ages, you have to add more and more new plastic material and substance to the stuff that's being recycled in order to regenerate it back out the other end. So whilst it does mitigate the problem of marine plastics and plastics more broadly, it isn't a solution to it really. Okay. And again, so what for the oceans? So something that you're probably acutely aware of, like I say, if you are a diver or have an interest in marine conservation, is the entrapment or entanglement of particular larger marine mammals and whales and dolphins, but even much smaller species that are out there. A big problem. How much of a problem that is for affecting biodiversity and the mass of marine mammals is unclear, unknown, but it is very visible and it does pull on the heartstrings of people when you see those horrible pictures of whales and dolphins caught up in these sorts of things. Some things that are as big a problem, if not bigger, than just the entrapment of marine life is the fact that microplastics or plastics break down in the marine environment, even if they're not properly decomposing. The effect of sunlight and then the physical effect of being thrown around the ocean breaks them down into smaller and smaller particles. And there's a possibility that as it gets smaller and it gets consumed by smaller organisms in the ocean, then it can accumulate up the food chain. And ultimately that could be a problem in terms of contaminating life, including humans, when it gets to the top of the food chain. There's also a lot of chemicals used in the production of plastics, and those tend to leach out once they're in the oceans. Again, the breaking down of the sunlight breaking down the plastics, and the fact that they're just sat in the ocean means that they do seep out of the plastics that are in the ocean. And it also has the effect of compounding climate change. So one of the things we mentioned when we were talking about the Earth's heat budget was the fact that the ice that can reflect sunlight back out into the atmosphere rather than absorbing it. And if you have a huge expanse of plastics sat in the middle of the ocean, then that can also change how the energy is absorbed or reflected, by reflecting more than would be if it was just clean ocean surface. So there is a theory and a lot of academic writing out there that suggests that it affects climate change as well. So the real solution is finding alternatives to plastics, and that is a difficult challenge, but it's something that is very topical at the moment and something that is looking to be addressed. Right, John, I'm just going to pause there for 2 seconds. Any questions come up from that section? Probably just lots more abuse given the rice Mars I've seen on your screen.
Yeah, pretty much. The only question we've got so far is, will this be recorded to watch later? And the answer is yes, assuming that Facebook do everything that it should just work. So yes, this should be able to be shared out after the event. And if anyone's missed any parts and have joined us late, then they can re-watch the recording once the live stream has finished. Yeah, that's it at the moment.
Brilliant, thanks, John. Okay, I'm just going to touch very, very quickly on overfishing and the challenges of sustainable fishing. It is a pretty emotive subject. Because it provides livelihood for a lot of people, and obviously it provides food for a lot of people, but it is something that can also have an impact on the marine environment. So it can destroy habitats in the case of bottom trawling. It certainly reduces fish stocks, and the reduction of large fish such as cod and tuna has a real impact on the biodiversity of the oceans, because it's taking out a big slice of the food web, which means that other species can fill that void or can overpopulate because they no longer have that prey sitting above them in the food web. And that reduction of biodiversity is an issue. I'm sure a number of you will have seen the the fantastic David Attenborough episode that was on Netflix recently, where he talks about biodiversity needed to maintain the health of all ecosystems really on the planet. So overfishing is another thing that is can be a huge problem. Slide moving on. Yeah, great. Okay, so that's maybe a slightly depressing 20 minutes of talking about some of the problems that are faced by the oceans and by us as a human population. But hopefully it just sets up some of the challenges. And what I'm going to try and do now for the final sort of 5 or 10 minutes is just talk about what we as divers and through Project Baseline are trying to achieve. So some of the problems we have in having action taken in the oceans are the fact that it's just out of sight and therefore out of mind. So both in terms of the fact that it sits offshore, you can see a few miles from stood on a cliffside on the side of the oceans, and the second you get 12 nautical miles outside of any country, off any country's coastline, it becomes international waters, and therefore policing that and doing anything about it is hugely challenging through international law. But even in our own waters, within that 12 nautical mile limit, it's still out of sight because divers really are the only people who have the privilege of seeing what's happening underwater. And we have a real opportunity, I think, even as recreational divers, to educate the wider public. I don't mean educate necessarily in terms of doing these sorts of talks all the time, but just talking to people about what you see underwater and talking about how things are changing if you see change when you're going diving. So the pictures here are some interesting examples of where divers have brought things to the public attention. Some of you may be aware of some of them. The picture top right is a fairly recent one from Scottish waters where some recreational divers found loads of ray egg cases. And these are actually from flapper skate, which are extremely rare in British waters, and their breeding grounds are, or were certainly relatively unknown. And only through these recreational divers showing through pictures and video what they found did that come to public attention. And now there's a real drive to push for conservation of that area, especially around the breeding time. And then the other two sit as a pair, the two on the bottom there. So the picture on the left are flame shells, absolutely stunning species that are around the UK. And that's a sort of before and after picture. So the right-hand side picture shows the effect of bottom dredging on the Scottish lochs. And again, it was only through divers going out and witnessing this change that it came to the public attention. And that is now a protected area to allow, I believe it is now a protected area to allow the ecosystem to recover. So hopefully those two examples just show how recreational divers, citizen scientists as we might call them, can bring things to the attention of the public and make a bid for change. And that leads nicely on to Project Baseline and what Project Baseline is trying to achieve, really. So often a single snapshot of something isn't all that helpful in lobbying for change. So over generations, people will have taken their first steps or first fins into the aquatic realm, and they'd have been pretty amazed by what they've seen. But inevitably, through their generation and successive generations, there will have been change, and probably not change for the better, as suggested by some of the points that I've made previously in the presentation. And it's only if you can show that change to people who have influence in protecting it, is there going to be any action taken to protect it and allow it to regenerate. And that's really the genesis of Project Baseline. So it's about taking a snapshot in time of a particular environment, putting that on record, and then having something to go back and compare it to in the future. And that's why a lot of the local projects that we do in the UK, and there's some, in fact, there are a lot globally as well, are great because they're sites that are dived by the same divers over and over again. So they're the best people really to look out for change over time and be able to bring that to people's attention. And that is what Project Baseline is all about and what it's trying to get at, really. Get the IT to work. Good. So, Project Baseline in the UK and really around most of the world has been about local projects and passionate volunteers starting projects and maintaining them and doing what pretty much what they like with them. It's maybe has a bit of a reputation of being just about taking some visibility and temperature data, and whilst that's a nice little project in itself, and it is not to be sort of sniffed at. With Project Baseline, you can do pretty much whatever you want with it. You only have to look at some of the fantastic examples out there, like in Sardinia, where they've got a Project Baseline team monitoring the caves around the coast of Sardinia, and they've done some fantastic work with researchers and academics and marine scientists, have articles published. So it can be, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that it can be taken as far as you want it to go. But the theory behind it is the same. It's about educating people about what you're seeing and monitoring the marine environment. So the change that we're hoping to do with Project Baseline UK is we're hoping to do more collaborations with other government departments and scientific bodies and run slightly more in-depth projects on an annual basis. So to do that over the next, well, certainly into next year, if coronavirus allows, we're hoping to set ourselves up as an independent charity so that we can raise funds to support those projects and buy equipment we need to properly generate results that can be utilised by those government departments that I talked about. We're going to run more training weekends so that we can get recreational divers in a position where they can be helpful on those events. And what that hopefully does is it gives an outlet for the data that's collected by the divers. So one of the real challenges that we have in some of the local projects is finding a use for the data, because that gives motivation, I think, for the divers to continue going out diving and developing these projects. Great, and that's me. So hopefully I've introduced you, for those that maybe aren't as aware as others, some of the challenges faced by, well, not just the oceans, but more broadly, but some of the, certainly localising it to the underwater environment, and then talking a little bit about the benefit that recreational divers can have in highlighting some of the changes that they see underwater, and showing that is something that we can get at through Project Baseline. The last thing I would touch on before I see if John's got any final questions is, or any questions from the audience, is that it's such an easy thing to get involved with. It can be as simple as just finding your local dive site in 6 meters of water and taking those visibility and temperature readings that I talked about. And once you get good at that, it can easily be scaled up to involve some much more eye-catching things like photogrammetry or doing transects and working with Sea Search and other useful marine science bodies to actually find an outlet for the data that you're gathering, which for me is where we really add value, is when we collaborate with people who can take the data that we as hopefully relatively well-trained divers can go out and collect that they couldn't do in the sort of mass of numbers that we can. Good, and that's me really. I'm going to pause there, and hopefully John's going to come in, and if there's any questions,
yeah.
Great.
Yeah, we've got some good questions actually by the looks of things. So I'm going to pull these up, see if my magic button works. Let's give this one a go. Oh, hello. No, not quite. What's going on? Okay, I'll cancel that and try.
Just before we take the questions, I'm just going to point out that John is also an avid project diver and has done Project Baseline stuff, so I may refer to you, John, as well if they're too difficult.
Yeah, luckily these look mostly nice and squishy things. Right, let's try that again with the right button. And there we go. Yes, right. So Jason has asked.
Jason.
What are the Project Baseline views on the possible introduction of the 3 mile rule to restrict bottom trawling?
Yeah. Hi, Jason. Hope you're well. I hope you're managing to get out to diving in the Clyde with everything that's going on in Scotland. Uh, so, really good question. I mean, a really difficult one because, as I said when I talked about the overfishing point, the second you talk about fishing restrictions, it's such an emotive topic for really good reason. You know, it's the livelihood for a lot of people. Um, Whereas as recreational divers, all we want is to see all of the oceans protected and those ecosystems to develop. So I would say that a balance needs to be struck. And I think the challenge we have in the UK is we have a lot of marine protected areas on paper, but they're on paper only. Whereas if you look at what's been done off Lyme Regis, where they have implemented a marine protected area and they've employed, not employed, but they've got the fishermen on side and shown the fishermen the benefit of protecting certain areas of the coastline, and they've seen their catches increase as a result of these areas not being fished. So I think that's the approach that works best. So Project Baseline doesn't have an official view on whether we should restrict fishing out to 3 miles, but my personal view is that some form of protection properly implemented with the support of the community, including the fishermen, is the best way forward. And like I say, that example in Lyme Regis is a great example. I think, again, my personal view only, I think a blanket 3 mile protection is probably too blunt a tool to suit everybody.
Yeah, I went to a talk a few years ago from an Italian marine biologist from one of the islands in Italy, and I know that they had introduced a fairly strict no fish zone. So they had like a three-phase thing with one area was actually no motorboat, like no motorcraft at all. No,
Mm.
so you could go swimming there, but you couldn't, and you could go kayaking, but you couldn't have any motorized boats. And then there was basically a no fish zone, and then a zone that was fishing under license only. And basically,
Mm.
the local, yeah, exactly that. The local fishing community were brought on board with that and with making the decisions about that. And I think over the 5 or 6 years that it was running, they saw their catch massively improve because suddenly there were spaces
Yeah.
out there for the fish to actually become fish. Um,
Yeah.
but I think yes, I think
And,
a fully joined up system is what's needed there. I don't think there's any quick
mm.
answer.
And the other reason that the 3 mile rule is probably a bit of a blunt tool is that you also need some of the deeper water protected because some of the species just come in to breed in the shallow waters. So if you don't protect them in the deeper water as well, then potentially you're taking away the reproducing adults, and it doesn't work. So you need this sort of. I think you need, and a lot of the academic evidence will suggest this sort of network of protected areas that allow fishing in and around them, so that both activities are supported.
Okay, so next question is from Ryan.
Thanks for that, Jason. That was a nice, easy one to start.
Oh, okay, is that not triggered? Let me try that again. Right, let's go send that. Yes, there we go. From Ryan. If divers find an area that they think needs protecting, what channels can they use to go about that?
So by channels, Ryan, do you mean what sort of they do, or something else? Do you mean what? How do they get started? I guess
I,
is the
I,
question.
I would answer that question. There'll be a bit too much of a delay to get an answer
Yeah,
from Ryan, but
fine.
he'll
Okay.
he'll come back in, and I'm sure in a minute.
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of ways. So I mean, this being a project baseline talk, then it'd be crazy not to say project baseline is one of the ways you could go about it. But I think if you're going to have proper impact, then it needs to be a collaborative thing. So project baseline is a great structure to get you started, and in the UK we try and provide support to people who want to start up a local project. And that's like I say, a great way of sort of advertising what's going on in your local area. Some other fantastic ways are things like Sea Search. So Sea Search is a fantastic sort of training and monitoring sort of survey effort that's headed up by the Marine Conservation Society. And essentially, you go and do a 2-day course, and you know most of this, Ryan, but for the wider audience, there's basically a day of training in the classroom where you learn how to fill out these forms, and then a day where you go out and put that in practice in the water. And the great thing about that is that when you submit that data, it's put into a formal database and recorded, so that it can be that data is actually finding real value. There's a lot of non-government sort of conservation efforts. So Blue Marine are out there, Our Seas. So getting on Facebook and Google and finding out who else is having an impact in the area, and making an effort and collaborating with them to find out how you as divers can fit into that sort of broader puzzle to solve the issue. Because we alone, as passionate sort of recreational divers, probably aren't going to solve the problem. But if we can get together with people who have got sort of money and equipment to help us do the survey, and then scientists to analyse it and take action on it, then I think we have a much better chance. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Well, he hasn't come back yet, so he's either fallen asleep or that's fine. Right, and actually, following on really nicely from that answer, here's a question from Sam, and he's asking, how does a project baseline project differ from a sea search one?
Yeah, really good question. So, I mean, the first thing is they are completely different organisations. So we make no secret of the fact that Project Baseline was initially a GUE conservation initiative, and although it is now a standalone conservation entity, it's also a global project. So we have local projects around the world, and also they try and do like a cornerstone sort of capping mission, once a year or once every couple of years as well. It also, I would say, tries to do a larger variety of things than sea search. So sea search is very much about divers in the UK going and filling out survey forms and just recording. I say just, it's a great project to be involved with, but recording marine species and sending them into the Marine Conservation Society. Whereas with Project Baseline, you can make the project as broad as you want. So some of the things I mentioned, where you can use photogrammetry to monitor the environment, like some of the guys out in Canada are doing, and John, I think you helped with some of the team in Sardinia doing some of that for the caves out there. That you can do proper sort of scientific diving techniques, such as running transects. I think it's more scalable than perhaps sea search is, but ultimately they're both trying to get after the same thing. And whilst we haven't formally collaborated with sea search, we do a lot of sea search reporting when we do our Project Baseline weekends in the UK. So I think the key difference is the scalability of Project Baseline and the ability to do more than just that sort of survey form completion, and the fact that it's a global project. I'm genuinely not selling sea search short there. The fantastic thing about sea search is that they are backed by a really passionate core team of marine scientists and marine biologists who make that a fantastic project in itself.
Let me find another question. I'm gonna pull up an awkward one from Rich. That's always good.
Oh no, Rich is walking. Rich Walker's watching.
Yeah.
Put me under pressure.
So Rich has asked, without an initial question to answer, do you think there's a danger that diver collected data will be of limited value?
Yes, definitely. A really good question. I think that some of the challenges we've had, being frank, with some of the Project Baseline sites and projects is not having an outlet for the data. So what we're really trying to do with Project Baseline UK is raise the profile and collaborate more with other entities that want that information, want that data. So we're hoping next year we're going to run an interesting collaboration up around IMouth, where we'll go and do what we're good at, which is, as passionate divers, go and collect the data, hopefully relatively well-trained, passionate divers, which allows us to collect valuable data and then pass that on to much more qualified entities than Project Baseline UK to take that well-collected, documented data and then put it together with data collected by other marine scientists and have it properly analysed and used. So, as I'm sure knows, it is very and for me, the real strength comes when we collaborate and find a proper outlet for the data. Sadly, it's also one of the most difficult things to achieve as a sort of lowly starting out citizen diver, because to get recognised and demonstrate that you have the capabilities to support some of those efforts can be challenging.
Yeah, so there's a couple of comments on here about sea search. Jason Guthrie here has mentioned that the last Scottish Sea Search Observer course was actually last week, but there will probably be more in the spring, and they can be arranged on an on-demand basis, and that they're now using Zoom for the tutorial sessions and so on.
Oh, great.
So that's kind of cool. And various people.
Yeah, just to reiterate, I may have sounded like I was underselling it a little bit, but it is a fantastic thing to get involved with. It genuinely is really good.
Yeah. So here's one that comically is going to come through as PBUK because it's actually from Owen, who's obviously signed in with his admin account rather than his personal account. There we go, that's all right. And his question is, what do you say to the argument that actions at an individual level are insignificant when compared to the impact caused at the industrial scale? And how does PBUK contribute to enacting systematic change? Nice difficult Owen.
There's a lot in that. So, are the actions of an individual insignificant? I would say that probably they are. If it was just me going out and collecting this data and advertising it on my own, then yes, that's probably insignificant. However, I think we've seen through things like the awareness of marine plastics, where the strength of public opinion has just grown and grown as we've shown some of the terrible impacts of that through things like Ghost Fishing UK, through the press, through various documentaries. I think a collection of individuals has a much stronger voice, and arguably, has that caused any change or impact at industrial scale? Probably one open for debate, but I think it has seen a slight cultural change away from the use of some single-use plastics. And so I think if those individuals hadn't started down that road, then I don't think we'd have got to where we are now in trying to change some of the behaviours that we have. So yes, I think at an individual level it's very difficult, but if we don't start somewhere and try and generate momentum, then we'll never get anywhere. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to generate more momentum in the UK to have meaningful projects and contribute more, and hopefully have our voices heard and hopefully lobby for change.
I think the
hopefully that's partly answered the question.
Yeah, I think all of the GhostNet stuff is actually quite a good example of that. It started off with 3 or 4 individuals, and it's now grown to a fairly large worldwide community, all kind of communicating together. And I think that's the nice thing about Project Baseline is it's not just you and your dive buddy on your local beach. You become part of a global initiative and have the support and expertise out there to help you, go in the right direction. And it's one of those things that once things have been successful in one geographical area in the world, it's much easier to take that and follow it up in other areas. I think that's a big power of Project Baseline.
Yeah, and just to touch on that support piece, John, what we're trying to do with Project Baseline UK is we're trying to provide a bit more support to people that want to do something locally. So we for all the local project sort of site managers now, we have a quarterly Zoom call, all very informal, but it allows us to talk about what we're doing, what we've managed to achieve, and then those who've got a bit more experience can provide some input and hopefully help support the teams and form collaborations and hopefully make those individual voices more collective. And that's the aim of making it a sort of national effort rather than just a sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Right, next question from Sarah. And we have, as well as the monitoring, could PBUK have more of a role in raising awareness and promoting good practice amongst the dive community and beyond?
And an example there is what's a sustainability rating for dive operators and charters, annual awards. Yeah, great stuff. Some really nice bits in there. Yes, is the answer. We would love to do more to promote what we're doing and therefore the plight of the marine environment. I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg. We need to get stuck into some nice projects, see some real results from some of the collaborations that we're working on, and hopefully then that will come. At the moment, I think we're a little bit in the stage of sharing some sort of successes that we've had in one local area. So if you look at Loch Long, the projects that we've done up there, we've had some success with some scientific input, and I think now we need to develop that and do a bit more and have these more formal collaborations, so that we've got something to show and something to push in terms of that awareness and education piece. So yeah, it's definitely something we're keen to do. Clearly, things like this are trying to get at that and trying to raise awareness of the project itself. So yeah, good question. The annual awards thing is an interesting one. Something we would love to do is have an annual, I don't know what we would call it, but annual marine conservation night where all of those that are involved in some sort of citizen science effort, we've mentioned some of them, Sea Search, Ghost Fishing UK, those sorts of people, and some scientific community members can come along and they can all present what they've been doing and again help that individual collection of individuals become a group voice and hopefully maximise the impact that's felt.
Yep. Okay, cool. And I think this would be the last one. I'm going to pull this one up. This is a question that kind of follows on from a few other questions as well in here, and this is from Jason Coles. Basically saying wants to get more involved. He's got lots of temperature viz data, and is there anything else as a skipper he can help with in this area? But also then a little bit on the, what's the next step if as a diver, this is really up your street, and you want to either get involved in an existing project baseline or start off your own project baseline.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that. There's one, how as a local dive skipper can Jason contribute, and then one about setting up projects, I think. So I mean, Jason, absolutely fantastic to have the support of people who are diving regularly in a particular area, because clearly that is therefore showing a baseline and a change over time. So we've already talked a little bit about getting more regular data in from you and your divers, and that's a fantastic asset. And the challenge we've had is making it as easy as possible for firstly the divers to take the readings, for you to take them off the divers and then to submit them, and as you know, we're still working on that, but the support of other dive operators would be fantastic, because you're just getting, the more data you have, the more data points you have, the more evidence you've got to show something has changed. So that's the first half of it. In terms of setting up projects, there is plenty of help out there. I think divers should start with without too high an ambition. So just pick your local site where you're diving regularly, because that regular data entry again is what we need to show evidence of change. And there's a couple of ways you go about it. You could reach out to me directly on email or on Facebook. You could go to Project Baseline direct, and Todd and Christy over there will provide support to get the project up and running. But it's really easy to start up. It's an application form. a pretty short online application form, and then a case of picking what you want to do, picking your site, and off you go, really. And it is as easy as doing some temperature and visibility if that's what you want to do to start with. But like I say, it can then be expanded, and much more value can be added with the experience as that builds. So hopefully that answers the two parts of the question.
Cool. I think that's awesome. I think there's no more. Well, there's a few other little questions in there, but we can have a look at the chat later. There will a lot of follow-on things. But yeah, awesome. So as Marcus says, basically, if anyone wants to get involved, then do inundate Marcus with messages, and he'll point you in the right direction. It's from my personal experience, getting involved in project diving is one of the things that keeps diving interesting. That you start out diving and just being underwater is a really cool thing. Being able to breathe whilst underwater is mind blowing and it's amazing. But it doesn't take too long before you start needing something a little bit extra, something to keep you getting out of bed at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning when it's raining outside and actually go and get into the water. So I think it's stuff like Project Baseline and project diving in general is a really good way of keeping that interest and giving you good reasons to build up your skills. Get comfortable. It says here, Owen says, "Thank you very much, Marcus, but he can't appear as himself." Okay. Owen's obviously having an identity crisis in the thing there.
Good.
Marcus, remind me who have we got? We've got some more talk, haven't we?
So we've got Martin Maple next Friday talking about Midland Pools, and that's going to be a really nice talk, I think, actually, because they are, whilst they're monitoring an inland site, and I don't say that to say it's any lesser project than those done in the sea, but they're actually really trying to apply some scientific technique to that, and they've got some collaborations building with local authorities and scientists, so it'd be really great to hear about that. Then the following week, another really exciting presentation from Vanessa and Martin. So they're a couple who run a project. They live on the Isle of Skye. If you haven't been, an absolutely stunning part of the west coast of Scotland, some lovely diving around there. And they're monitoring firework anemones in one of the local lochs and working with Sea Search on that, actually. And they're producing some great results, and again are applying some really interesting techniques to that monitoring process, so that'd be great. And then we finish up on Monday, I think it's the 30th of November, right at the end of the month, where we are lucky enough to have Todd come along and talk to us about Baseline Explorer, which was the huge ship that they had. I don't know how long it was, actually. Probably a good few weeks on.
6 months.
Was it?
Well,
right, 6 months. But he's going to talk specifically about the stuff they did in Bermuda. So he'll show you fancy pictures of. He won't show you fireworks anemones and silty lochs. He's going to show you submarines with divers and rebreathers at depth, scootering along beautiful clear reefs. But it's hopefully going to be a really good presentation to finish up with.
Oh, good stuff. All right, let me see if I can find the right buttons to turn this off.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody.